Richard Lawson slammed the folder shut and looked at his wife like she was a stranger standing in his way. "Sign it, Emily. Just sign it. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." That was how he greeted her after 7 years of marriage on the morning their entire life was reduced to a stack of papers on a glass table. No warmth, no hesitation. Just a man in a rush to erase her. Emily Carter sat very still. Her hands were folded in her lap, and for a moment she said nothing at all. The silence stretched so long that Richard actually looked uncomfortable, as if her calm was more unsettling than tears would have been. "You're not even going to fight?" he asked, almost accusing her of it. "Would it change anything?" Emily said quietly. Richard exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "No," he admitted. "It wouldn't." That was the moment she understood fully, and finally that the man across the table had already left her long before this meeting. He had left her in 100 small ways she had chosen not to notice the meetings. He stopped inviting her to the dinners, where he introduced her as "my wife," instead of by her name, the nights he came home smelling faintly of another woman's perfume, and she told herself it was nothing. She picked up the pen. Her fingers didn't shake. That surprised even her. "You're really doing this," Richard said almost to himself, watching her sign. There was something in his voice, not sadness, not really, impatience, like a man closing a business deal that had dragged on too long. "You're the one who filed, Richard," she said softly. "I'm only finishing what you started." He didn't answer that. He just watched her write her name, watched the woman who had spent 7 years building his world quietly hand it back to him without asking for a single thing in return. Outside the office, the city moved on as if nothing had happened. Cars honked, people walked past holding coffee cups, laughing at something on their phones. None of them knew that inside that glass office, a marriage and a woman's entire identity had just ended in less than 20 minutes. Emily walked to her car in the parking garage, and only once she was inside, only once the door was shut and the world outside was muffled, did she allow her hands to tremble. She gripped the steering wheel and closed her eyes. She didn't cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't, but her chest ached in a way she didn't have words for. Not grief, exactly. Something closer to disbelief. 7 years. 7 years of showing up, of believing that loyalty meant something, that quiet devotion counted for anything at all. And in the end, he hadn't even looked her in the eye when he asked her to sign. She thought about this early days, the night she'd sat beside him at their small kitchen table, going over spreadsheets by lamplight, while he paced the room, terrified his company would collapse before it ever had a chance to begin. She thought about the investor meeting. He almost lost the one where she'd quietly slipped him a note with 3 numbers on it. Numbers that saved the deal, and he'd taken the credit without a second thought, without even a glance her way afterward. She had told herself it didn't matter, that real love didn't need applause. But somewhere along the way, not needing applause had turned into never being seen at all. Now she sat in a parking garage freshly divorced and wondered what exactly 7 years of invisibility had earned her. At the courthouse 2 weeks later, everything became official. Richard stood beside his lawyer in a charcoal suit, looking every bit the confident founder the business magazines loved to photograph. Emily stood several feet away in a plain gray coat, holding a single folder that contained essentially everything she now owned. It wasn't much. She hadn't asked for much. Reporters had gathered outside, not for her, of course. For him. Richard Lawson, the tech visionary, was newsworthy. His quiet, unremarkable wife was not. "Any comment on the divorce, Mr. Lawson?" one of them called out. Richard offered a practiced, gracious smile, the kind he'd clearly rehearsed. "Emily is a good person," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "But people grow, people change direction. This is simply not the life she wanted." Emily heard every word. She didn't correct him. She didn't tell the reporters that it wasn't her direction that had changed at all, that she had wanted exactly the life they'd built together, the one he'd slowly stripped away from her piece by piece until there was nothing left of her in it. Standing a few feet from Richard, holding his arm with unmistakable ease, was Vanessa Cole, young, polished and executive at his company, wearing a smile that seemed to say she had already claimed the space Emily was leaving behind. Emily looked at her for exactly 1 second, long enough to notice the confidence, long enough to notice that Vanessa didn't even attempt to hide her satisfaction. Then Emily turned and walked toward the courthouse doors. "Emily." Richard's voice caught her before she reached them. She stopped, but didn't turn around immediately. "I expected you to fight," he said, quieter now, only for her. "I expected, I don't know, something. Anger, tears." Emily finally faced him. "Would that have made you feel better, Richard, if I begged?" He didn't answer. His jaw tightened. "You didn't want a wife who fought for you," she continued, voice steady. "You wanted a wife who never demanded anything, so you could give everything to someone else without guilt." For a moment, just a moment, something flickered across his face. Not quite regret, maybe confusion, as if hearing his own choices spoken aloud made them sound uglier than he'd allowed himself to admit. But he said nothing. Emily nodded once as if she hadn't expected him to, and turned toward the courthouse doors. That was when everything changed. A black luxury SUV pulled up directly in front of the courthouse steps, sleek, expensive, the kind of vehicle that made photographers instinctively lift their cameras even before they knew who was inside. The door opened. A man stepped out, tall, composed, dressed in a dark coat that looked like it cost more than most people's annual salary. He moved with the unmistakable ease of someone who had never once in his life had to wait in line, explain himself, or ask permission. The courthouse steps went quiet. Someone in the small crowd whispered his name, and the whisper spread like fire through dry grass. That's Alexander Vale." Richard's head snapped up. His expression shifted from mild confusion to disbelief in the span of a second. Alexander Vale, one of the most powerful investors in the country. A man Richard had spent 3 entire years, trying to get a single meeting with. He had sent proposals. He had used contacts. He had practically begged for 15 minutes of the man's time and had been politely declined every single time. And now, impossibly, Alexander Vale was walking up the courthouse steps toward Emily. "No," Richard muttered under his breath. "No, that's not..." But it was. Alexander walked past Richard, entirely past the reporters, past Vanessa's stunned expression, and stopped directly in front of Emily. His face, so composed a moment before, softened the instant his eyes landed on her. "Are you ready to come home?" he asked her. The words landed on the courthouse steps like a bomb going off in slow motion. Richard's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Home. Why would Alexander Vale, a man he'd chased for 3 years, call his ex-wife this quiet, unremarkable woman he'd just divorced home? "Emily." Richard finally managed stepping forward. "What is this? Do you..." He stopped looking between her and Alexander, trying to piece together a puzzle that made no sense. "Do you know him?" Emily didn't answer immediately. She looked at Alexander first, and something passed between them, an understanding quiet and old, the kind shared only by people who had known each other their entire lives. "Richard," she said finally, turning to face the man who had just spent 20 minutes publicly explaining why he no longer wanted her. "This is my brother." The silence that followed was the loudest sound Richard had ever heard. "You're..." He blinked. "You're what?" "My brother," Emily repeated. "Alexander Vale." Vanessa's confident smile had completely disappeared. She looked between Emily and Alexander as if trying to find the trick, the joke, the explanation that would make this make sense. Because surely this quiet woman in a plain gray coat wasn't related to one of the wealthiest families in the country. Vale. Richard repeated the word, barely making it out of his mouth. As in the Vale family," Alexander said, his voice calm, almost bored, as if he were confirming something as simple as the weather. "You've heard of us, I assume, given how hard you tried to get my attention for the past 3 years. Richard's face went pale. "Emily is my younger sister," Alexander continued, and he said it not with pride, not with cruelty, but simply as fact, a fact that had apparently been hidden in plain sight for years, right under Richard's nose, right inside his own home. The last heir of the Vale family. Reporters who had been filming Richard's polished divorce statement moments earlier were now scrambling cameras spinning toward Emily, toward Alexander, sensing that the real story of the day had just walked up the courthouse steps. "That's not possible," Richard said, shaking his head, laughing in the disbelieving way people do when reality refuses to match what they've always assumed. Emily doesn't, she's never... He turned to her. You never said anything. 7 years, Emily. 7 years, and you never once mentioned, you never asked. Emily said simply. And that single sentence hit him harder than anything else that day. Because it was true. In 7 years of marriage, Richard Lawson had never once asked his wife about her family, her past, the life she'd lived before him. He had assumed there was nothing there worth asking about. He had decided without ever saying it aloud that Emily was simple, quiet, unremarkable, a woman without ambition, without history, without anything of her own to bring to the table except loyalty. He had been catastrophically wrong. Why? Richard said, his voice breaking slightly. Why would you hide something like this? Why would you let me believe? Because I wanted someone to love me, Emily said. And for the first time that day, her composure cracked just slightly, just enough for the pain underneath to show. Not my name, not my family, not what I could give you. Me. Richard stared at her. And for 7 years, she continued, I told myself it didn't matter that you never really saw me. I told myself that was just how love worked, quiet, patient, unselfish. I stayed small because I thought that's what you needed. Emily, but you didn't need a small wife, Richard. Her voice was steady again, now sharp in its calmness. You needed someone to blame for feeling ordinary, and once you found someone who made you feel important again. Her eyes flicked briefly, deliberately to Vanessa. You didn't need me at all. Vanessa's face flushed red. She opened her mouth as if to defend herself, then thought better of it, the accusation landing too precisely to argue with. Alexander stepped slightly closer to his sister, his presence unmistakably protective. I think you've said everything that needs to be said here, Emily. She nodded. Wait! Richard's voice cracked with something close to panic now. The reality of what was happening, the cameras, the whispers already spreading through the small crowd, the name Vale being repeated over and over, was beginning to sink in, and with it, something far worse than embarrassment. Emily, wait. If this is true, if you really are, if I really am who I am, Emily said quietly, then what, Richard? What changes for you? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew what he was really asking. Not, who are you? But what have I lost? You had 3 years trying to get a meeting with my brother, Emily said. You had access this entire time. You were married to it, and you spent 7 years making sure I felt too small to ever mention it. I didn't know, Richard said, desperate now. How could I have possibly? You didn't know because you never looked, Emily said. You were too busy deciding I wasn't worth looking at. Alexander placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. The car is waiting. Emily nodded, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to simply walk away without explaining herself, without softening the blow, without worrying about how her calm might make someone else feel. Emily, Richard called after her, his voice cracking through the crowd, through the reporters, through Vanessa's frozen expression. Emily, please. She didn't turn around. The SUV door opened. Alexander guided her inside with quiet, practiced care, the kind of care that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd had to shield his sister from something or someone. Just before the door closed, Emily glanced back one final time, not at Richard. At the courthouse itself, the building where minutes earlier she had signed away 7 years of her life without a single tear. She didn't feel triumphant, not yet. Mostly, she felt tired, the particular exhaustion of a person who has spent years making herself smaller and has only just realized how much energy that had cost her. The door shut. The engine started, and as the SUV pulled away from the courthouse steps, Richard Lawson stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring after the woman he had just called, no longer fitting into the life he was building. A woman who, it turned out, could have handed him a life beyond anything he'd ever dreamed of building on his own. Vanessa stepped closer to him, her voice hesitant for the first time all day. Richard, what just happened? He didn't answer her. He was still staring at the space where the SUV had been, as if staring hard enough might rewind. The last 10 minutes might undo the papers he'd just signed, might undo 3 years of chasing a man whose sister had been sleeping beside him the entire time. Inside the SUV, Emily finally let her shoulders drop. She stared out the window as the courthouse disappeared behind them, as the city blurred past in streaks of gray and glass. "You didn't have to come," she said quietly to her brother. "Yes," Alexander said. "I did." She turned to look at him. "How did you even know today was the day?" "I've known about the divorce for 3 weeks, Emily." His voice was calm but firm. "I've known about a great many things for a great deal longer than that." Something in his tone made her sit up slightly straighter. "What things?" Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering how much to say. Then he reached into his coat and produced a slim folder, sliding it across the seat toward her. "Things Richard didn't want you to know," he said. "Things I think you deserve to see now." Emily looked down at the folder in her lap. Her name was printed neatly on the tab. Beneath it, a date from nearly a year ago. "You've been investigating him," she said slowly. "It wasn't a question." "I've been protecting you," Alexander corrected. "There's a difference, though. I understand it might not feel that way right now." Emily opened the folder with hands that were for the first time that day not entirely steady. The first page held a summary of financial transactions Richard's company dated back nearly 4 years. Her eyes moved down the page, and with every line something cold settled in her stomach. "These are the investor connections I made for him," she said quietly. "The early partners. I never told anyone I was the one who—" "I know," Alexander said. "He knew too, and he let the board believe he'd secured them entirely on his own." Emily flipped to the next page. Meeting minutes. Her name conspicuously absent from records of meetings. She distinctly remembered attending meetings where she'd sat quietly in the corner taking notes, offering advice Richard would repeat back to the room moments later as though the idea had originated with him. "He removed you from the official record," Alexander said. "Systematically, over years." "Why would he?" "Because acknowledging your involvement meant admitting he needed help," Alexander said simply. "And Richard Lawson has built an entire identity around never needing anyone." Emily's hands tightened slightly on the folder. She turned another page, and this time what she found made her breath catch entirely. Company records, benefits. Vanessa Cole's name appearing on a compensation adjustment dated 8 months earlier, long before today, long before the divorce was even filed. 8 months, Emily whispered. 8 months. Alexander confirmed, his voice quiet, but unmistakably angry, now the calm exterior cracking just slightly for his sister's sake. He was already planning to elevate her position before he ever filed the paperwork to end things with you. Emily closed her eyes. It wasn't the affair itself that hurt the most. She had suspected that much for a while, in the quiet way a person suspects something they aren't ready to fully confront. It was the calculation, the planning, the months of decisions made behind her back while she still came home every night, made dinner, asked about his day. Believed foolishly, she now realized that whatever distance had grown between them was simply the natural wear of a long marriage, not the deliberate architecture of her replacement. "I'm sorry," Alexander said, watching her carefully. "I debated whether to show you all of this today of all days, but I thought you deserved the truth rather than more protection from it." Emily nodded slowly, blinking back the sting behind her eyes. "No, you were right to show me." She sat in silence for a long moment, staring down at the folder, at the quiet, methodical proof of exactly how thoroughly she had been erased from her own life. "He's going to lose everything, isn't he?" she said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "That depends," Alexander said carefully, "on what you want to happen." Emily looked up at him. "You could destroy him, Emily. Completely. The moment word gets out that you're my sister, and it will get out faster than either of us can control, now every investor who ever trusted him because of connections you made will start asking questions. Every deal he's proud of will come under scrutiny. I could accelerate that process significantly if you wanted me to." "And if I don't want that?" "Then I'll do nothing," Alexander said simply. "It's your name on that folder, not mine. Your choice." Emily looked back out the window, watching the city give way slowly to open road to the long stretch of highway that would eventually lead them toward the Vale family estate, a place she hadn't called home in years, a place she'd left behind precisely because she'd wanted more than anything to be loved for herself, rather than her name. She thought of Richard's face on the courthouse steps, the disbelief, the dawning horror as he realized what he'd walked away from. She thought about 7 years of quiet devotion, unacknowledged, erased line by line from company records, as though she'd never existed at all. And then she thought of something else, something that surprised her given everything. She didn't want revenge, not exactly. "I don't want him destroyed," she said quietly. Alexander studied her. "Even after everything you just saw, especially after everything I just saw," she said, "destroying him doesn't undo what he did. It doesn't give me back 7 years. It would just make me feel powerful for a little while, and then I'd have to live with having used that power the same way he used his carelessly, and without thinking about who else gets hurt. There are employees who depend on that company," she continued, "people who had nothing to do with what Richard did to me. I don't want them paying for his mistakes." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, something like respect settling into his expression. "That's remarkably generous, Emily. More generous than I would be in your position." "I don't want generosity," Emily said. "I want accountability. There's a difference." "And what does accountability look like to you?" Emily considered the question carefully before answering. "An investigation, a real one. Let the truth come out on its own terms, not because I forced it, but because it's simply true. Let people see exactly what he did, exactly how the company was really built, and let them decide for themselves what that means." Alexander nodded slowly. "That I can arrange." The SUV continued down the highway, the city skyline shrinking behind them, and Emily allowed herself finally to feel the full weight of the day settle over her. Not as grief exactly, but as something heavier and more complicated. Relief tangled together with anger. Sadness braided with something that felt unmistakably like the beginning of freedom. She thought about the version of herself who had walked into that courthouse that morning, quiet, composed, prepared to disappear without protest. And she thought about the version of herself sitting in this car, now holding proof of exactly how much she had been worth all along. Exactly how much had been taken from her, without her ever raising her voice to stop it. She wasn't that quiet, disappearing woman anymore. She wasn't sure yet exactly who she was instead. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was determined to find out. Behind them, back at the courthouse, Richard Lawson was still standing on the sidewalk phone, pressed to his ear, his voice rising with barely controlled panic as he spoke to his lawyer. "I need you to find out everything you can about the Vale family," he said. "Everything. Today." On the other end, his lawyer's voice was cautious. "Richard, if she's really who that man says she is, this isn't the kind of family you investigate. This is the kind of family that investigates you." Richard closed his eyes, the truth of that sentence settling over him like a weight he couldn't yet fully carry. He had spent 7 years believing he was the one who mattered in that marriage, the visionary, the builder, the man whose name appeared in headlines while his quiet wife stood politely in the background, unremarkable, replaceable. He had just discovered in the cruelest possible way exactly how wrong he had been. And somewhere behind him, Vanessa Cole stood on the courthouse steps in her confident smile, still not quite understanding that the position she thought she'd won had in that single moment become infinitely more complicated than she'd ever imagined. The black SUV disappeared around a corner, carrying Emily Carter, no Emily Vale, toward a life Richard Lawson had never known existed, a life he had unknowingly married into, and then, in his arrogance, thrown away with his own hands. He had wanted a divorce. He had gotten one, but he was only now beginning to understand exactly what it had cost him. The Vale estate came into view just as the afternoon light began to soften, and Emily felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with Richard. "You haven't been back here in 3 years, Alexander said, watching her carefully. "I know," she said. "Are you ready for what's waiting inside?" Emily didn't answer right away. She was staring at the gates at the long driveway she used to walk barefoot as a teenager, at a life she had deliberately abandoned, so she could find out who she was without it. "I don't know," she admitted finally, "but I don't think I have much choice anymore." Inside the estate was quiet, in the particular way old wealth is quiet, not empty but restrained, every room holding itself with the discipline of people who had learned early never to raise their voices to be heard. Emily sat down at the long table in the study, the folder Alexander had given her still resting in her lap, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Alexander pulled out another set of documents. "There's more," he said. "I didn't want to give you everything in the car." Emily looked up sharply. "More. Richard's company took an emergency line of credit 11 months ago," Alexander said. "Quietly, never disclosed to the board in full detail. He used it to cover a shortfall that, as far as I can tell, came from a deal that fell through because he ignored advice he was given." "Whose advice?" Alexander looked at her steadily. "Yours." Emily's stomach dropped. "The Meridian deal. You remember it?" "Of course I remember it." Her voice had an edge now sharp with disbelief rather than sadness. "I told him the numbers didn't work. I told him the timeline they were promising was impossible, that they were overselling capacity they didn't have yet. He said I was being overly cautious. He said I didn't understand how these deals worked. He lost almost $4 million on that deal," Alexander said quietly, "and then borrowed against the company to cover it before anyone noticed." Emily sat back stunned into a silence that lasted almost a full minute. "I told him," she finally whispered. "I told him, and he didn't listen, and then he lied to everyone about why the company needed money." "He told the board it was for expansion," Alexander confirmed. "For hiring, growth initiatives. Nobody thought to ask why the numbers didn't quite add up because nobody thought to ask Richard Lawson anything. He'd built himself into someone people simply trusted." Emily pressed her fingers to her temples. "This is so much worse than I thought." "It usually is," Alexander said gently. "That's how these things work. You catch one thread and it's attached to 100 others." There was a knock at the study door, and a woman Emily hadn't seen in years stepped inside, Margaret, the family's longtime legal advisor, carrying a tablet under one arm, and an expression that suggested she already knew exactly how complicated this conversation was about to become. "Emily," Margaret said warmly, though her tone carried a professional weight underneath it. "It's good to see you again. I only wish it were under better circumstances." "So do I," Emily said. Margaret set the tablet down on the table. "Alexander asked me to prepare a preliminary assessment of Lawson Technologies' exposure, assuming certain facts come to light." "How bad is it?" Emily asked. Margaret hesitated. "Bad enough that if this were any other company, I'd advise immediate divestment from every investor currently on the board. The moment word gets out that key funding relationships were built entirely on undisclosed involvement from a member of the Vail family, and that some of those investors were misled about the company's actual financial health, you're not looking at reputational damage. You're looking at potential fraud allegations." Emily felt something cold settle over her. "Fraud," she repeated. "It's a strong word," Margaret said carefully, "but not an inaccurate one based on what we're seeing." Emily closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, her voice was steady again, though quieter than before. "I told Alexander in the car, I don't want him destroyed." "I understand that," Margaret said. "But Emily and I say this with respect. This may not entirely be your decision anymore. Once certain financial irregularities become visible to regulators, the process takes on a life of its own. You can choose not to accelerate it. You cannot necessarily choose to stop it." Emily absorbed that in silence. "What happens to the employees?" she asked finally. "The people who had nothing to do with any of this?" "That," Margaret said, "depends heavily on how quickly the company can be restructured and who ends up leading that restructuring. If it happens chaotically, people lose jobs. If it happens carefully with the right oversight, most of the damage can be contained to the people who actually caused it." Emily looked at her brother. "I want it to happen carefully." Alexander nodded slowly. "Then we'll need someone inside the company who can be trusted to protect the people who don't deserve to be punished for Richard's decisions." "Who would that even be?" Emily asked. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and something in his silence made Emily's stomach tighten before he even spoke. You, he said. Emily blinked. Me. You know that company better than anyone on its board, Emily. You helped build it. You know where the bodies are buried, so to speak, because you're the one who tried to stop most of them from being buried in the first place. I can't walk back into that company, Emily said, shaking her head. Richard would never allow it, and even if he did, the board would never. The board, Margaret interrupted gently, will very shortly have far bigger problems than what you think they'd allow. Once this investigation becomes public, they are going to be desperate for anyone who can demonstrate integrity and insider knowledge at the same time. That is an exceptionally rare combination right now, Emily, and you happen to embody both. Emily sat with that for a long moment, feeling the shape of her life shifting again faster than she could quite track. I need time to think, she said finally. You have some, Alexander said. Not much, but some. Meanwhile, across the city, Richard sat in his office with the blinds drawn, staring at his phone, which had not stopped buzzing for the better part of an hour. Emails, missed calls, a text from his chief financial officer that simply read, "We need to talk. Now." He ignored it. The door opened without a knock, and Vanessa walked in, her earlier confidence replaced with something far more brittle. "Richard, people are talking," she said. "Someone leaked something to a reporter. There's already a headline forming online." "What headline?" Richard said flatly, not looking up. Vanessa hesitated before answering, as if saying the words aloud would make them more real. "Something about you divorcing your wife without knowing she was a veil." Richard laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Of course there is." "Is it true?" Vanessa asked. "All of it. The company connections, the investors." "I don't know what's true anymore," Richard snapped, and immediately regretted the sharpness in his own voice. He took a breath, softening slightly. "I'm sorry, I need to think." Vanessa sat down across from him, her expression unreadable. "Richard, look at me. Did Emily really have that much to do with building this company?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Yes." He finally admitted the word costing him something visible. "More than I ever told anyone. More than I ever told her honestly." "Why would you hide that?" Richard rubbed his face with both hands. "Because admitting it meant admitting I couldn't have done this alone. And I built my entire identity around being the guy who did it alone. Investors don't want to fund a founder who needed his wife to hold his hand through every major decision. They want a visionary." "So you erased her?" "I didn't erase her," Richard said defensively, though even as he said it, the words felt hollow in his own mouth. "I just didn't correct the story people told about me." Vanessa studied him for a long moment. "That's the same thing, Richard." He didn't answer. His phone buzzed again. This time he looked at it. A message from an unknown number, no name attached, just 3 lines of text. "You should have listened to her about Meridian. You should have listened to her about a lot of things. Ask yourself why you never did." Richard's blood ran cold. He looked up sharply, scanning the room, as if the sender might somehow be standing there watching him read it. "What is it?" Vanessa asked, noticing the shift in his expression. "Nothing," Richard said too quickly, sliding the phone face down on the desk. But his hands weren't quite steady anymore. Back at the Vale estate, evening had settled fully, and Emily stood alone on the balcony outside her old childhood bedroom, staring out at grounds she hadn't walked in years. The air was cool, and for the first time all day, she allowed herself to simply exist without performing composure for anyone. Alexander found her there a few minutes later, 2 cups of tea in hand. He offered her one silently, and they stood together without speaking for a long while. "You're overthinking whether to take the position," he said finally. "I'm allowed to overthink it," Emily said. "It's a massive decision." "It is," Alexander agreed. "But you already know what you're going to say yes to Emily. I can see it on your face. You're just working up the courage to admit it to yourself." Emily let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost not. "Since when do you know me so well?" "Since always," Alexander said. "You forget I watched you grow up, refusing to let anyone else fight your battles for you, even when you probably should have let them. Emily wrapped both hands around her cup, staring out at the dark tree line in the distance. "If I go back into that company," she said slowly, "it's not going to be quiet. People are going to ask questions. They're going to want to know why I hid who I was for 7 years. They're going to wonder what kind of woman marries a man and lets him take credit for everything she built without saying a word. Some of them will," Alexander said. "Some of them will also wonder what kind of strength it takes to walk back into the exact place that erased you and rebuild it into something honest." Emily was quiet for a long moment. "I keep thinking about something Richard said to me once," she said finally. "Early in the marriage, before things changed, he told me he loved that I never needed to be the center of attention, that I made him feel like the smartest person in the room. And now I think he loved that I let him believe he was the smartest person in the room," Emily said. "There's a difference." Alexander nodded slowly. "There is. I spent 7 years being generous with my silence," Emily continued, her voice hardening slightly with each word. "I told myself it was strength, patience, love, but somewhere in there it stopped being a choice and started being a habit, a trap I built for myself and then couldn't figure out how to leave." "And now you're leaving it," Alexander said. "Now I'm leaving it," Emily agreed, loudly apparently, whether I intended to or not. The next morning the story broke fully. By 9 a.m., every major financial outlet was running some version of the headline, "Tech Founders Divorce Reveals Hidden Ties to Veil Family Fortune Questions, Mount Over Company's Origins." Richard's phone rang so many times before 10 that he eventually turned it off entirely. Sitting in his office in complete silence, staring at the wall as though it might offer some explanation for how thoroughly his life had unraveled in less than 24 hours. His CFO, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Reyes, walked into his office without waiting to be announced. "We need to talk about the board meeting," she said. "What board meeting?" "The emergency one that got called this morning while you had your phone off," Patricia said, her tone clipped with barely restrained frustration. "Richard, 3 investors have already called asking about their positions. One of them mentioned the word fraud in the same sentence as your name. Do you understand how serious that is?" Richard's stomach twisted. "I haven't committed fraud." "Then explain the Meridian line of credit," Patricia said flatly, "because right now on paper it looks exactly like you covered a massive loss and told the board it was for expansion." Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again, unable to find an answer that didn't sound exactly as damning as it apparently already looked. "I need you in that boardroom in 20 minutes, Patricia said. "And Richard, I'd strongly suggest you have a real explanation ready because right now, everyone in that room is going to be looking for someone to blame, and you are currently the only name on the list." The boardroom, when Richard finally walked in, was colder than he'd ever felt it. Faces that used to greet him with easy respect now regarded him with something closer to suspicion. Chairs that used to lean forward eagerly during his presentations now sat rigidly upright, arms crossed, waiting. "Richard," said the board chairman, a stern older man named Douglas Whitfield, "I think it's fair to say we have some questions." "I understand," Richard said, trying to steady his voice. "Is it true," Douglas continued, "that your ex-wife was directly responsible for securing several of our earliest and most significant investor relationships?" Richard hesitated. Every second of silence made the truth more obvious than any answer could have. "Yes," he said finally. A ripple moved through the room, not shock exactly, but confirmation. The particular tension of people realizing a suspicion they'd been quietly harboring was true. "And is it also true," Douglas continued, "that she explicitly warned you against the Meridian deal and that the resulting losses were covered through an undisclosed line of credit presented to this board as funding for expansion?" Richard's throat tightened. "It's more complicated than that." "Is it true?" Douglas repeated more firmly this time. "Yes or no?" Richard closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." The room erupted into overlapping voices, sharp and accusatory questions, flying faster than Richard could possibly answer them. He sat there absorbing it, feeling the walls of the empire he'd built over 7 years beginning to crack apart in real time. "Enough," Douglas said, finally silencing the room with a single raised hand. He turned back to Richard, his expression unreadable. Richard, I've supported you since the beginning. I believed in your vision, but I did not sign up to defend a company built on misrepresentation and possible financial fraud. It's not fraud, Richard said, though even to his own ears the protest sounded weaker each time he repeated it. That, Douglas said, will be for regulators to decide, not us. Effective immediately, the board is placing you on administrative leave pending a full independent investigation. Richard felt the floor tilt beneath him. You're removing me from my own company. We're protecting the company, Douglas corrected, something you apparently failed to do yourself. Richard sat frozen as the room slowly emptied around him, board members filing out with expressions ranging from pity to open contempt. Within minutes, he was alone in the boardroom he had once ruled with total, unquestioned authority. His phone buzzed. Another anonymous message. How does it feel to lose something because someone finally saw the truth? Richard stared at the screen, his hands trembling now, unmistakably. Who is this? He typed back, though some part of him already suspected he wouldn't get an answer. He was right. The message went unanswered. That evening, Emily sat again with Alexander and Margaret going over the final details of a decision that, despite her earlier hesitation, had become increasingly clear to her over the course of the day. I'll do it, she said. I'll go back into the company, not for Richard, not for revenge, for the people who are about to lose everything because of decisions they had no part in making. Margaret nodded, already making notes on her tablet. I'll begin drafting the necessary paperwork tonight. Given the board's current instability, I suspect they'll be extraordinarily receptive to your involvement. There's something else, Alexander said carefully, and something in his tone made Emily look up immediately. What? Richard's been placed on administrative leave, Alexander said, as of this afternoon. Emily absorbed that slowly. She'd expected consequences. She hadn't quite expected them to move this fast. How do you know that already? Because Douglas Whitfield called me personally an hour ago, Alexander said. He wanted to know if the Vale family had any interest in stabilizing the company during the transition. Emily's breath caught. And what did you tell him? I told him, Alexander said, that my sister would be in touch directly. Emily sat back slowly, feeling the full, dizzying weight of what was happening settle over her. 24 hours ago, she had been a quiet, unremarkable wife, signing divorce papers without protest. Now she was being handed quite literally the keys to the very company that had once erased her existence entirely. This is insane, she said quietly. This is justice, Alexander corrected gently. It just happens to look insane from the outside. The next morning, Emily walked into Lawson Technologies for the first time in over a year, dressed not in the muted, unassuming clothing she'd worn for 7 years as Richard's quiet wife, but in something sharper, more deliberate, the clothing of a woman who no longer had any interest in taking up less space than she deserved. The lobby went silent the moment she walked through the doors. Employees who had barely acknowledged her presence during company events now stared, openly whispering among themselves, trying to reconcile the woman they vaguely remembered as Richard's wife with the headlines they'd all read that morning. Patricia Reyes met her near the elevators, extending a hand with visible relief. Mrs. Carter, or, I apologize, I'm not sure what to call you now. Emily is fine, Emily said, shaking her hand firmly. The board is waiting, Patricia said. They're eager to hear your assessment. As they walked through the halls, Emily passed the old conference room where she used to sit quietly in the corner, taking notes. Nobody read, offering advice. Nobody credited. She paused just for a moment, looking through the glass at the empty table inside. Something wrong? Patricia asked. No, Emily said softly. Just remembering. They reached the boardroom, and as Emily stepped inside, every head turned toward her, the same room, the same faces that had once treated her as invisible, now watching her with a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and something that looked almost like hope. Douglas Whitfield rose to greet her. Ms. Vale, thank you for coming. Emily, she corrected gently. Just Emily for now. Emily, he repeated, gesturing toward the seat at the head of the table, the seat Richard had occupied for 7 years. We'd very much like to hear your thoughts on how we move forward from here. Emily looked at the empty chair for a long moment before finally sitting down. She thought of every meeting she'd once sat through in silence, every idea she'd once offered quietly through someone else's mouth, every year she'd spent making herself smaller so the people around her could feel bigger. "Let's start," she said, her voice calm, clear, and unmistakably her own, with the truth. All of it, no matter how uncomfortable it makes anyone in this room. Nobody argued. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Emily Carter. Emily Vale was not asking permission to be heard. She was simply being listened to. And across the city, in an apartment that suddenly felt far too large and far too quiet, Richard Lawson sat alone with his phone in his hand, staring at a news alert that made his chest go hollow. Emily Vale named interim advisor to Lawson Technologies Board, effective immediately. He read it 3 times before the words fully landed. The woman he had called replaceable was now quite literally deciding the future of the company. He had built his entire identity around the company he no longer had any control over at all. His phone buzzed one final time that evening. Another anonymous message, the last one he would receive for a while. "You had 7 years to see her. Now the whole world will." Richard set the phone down slowly, and for the first time since the divorce, he didn't feel angry. He felt afraid. The investigation moved faster than anyone at Lawson Technologies had anticipated, and within a week, Emily found herself sitting across from a team of forensic accountants, walking them through years of company history. From memory alone, memory that turned out to be more precise than any official record Richard had ever kept. "You remember the exact date of the Chen Capital meeting?" one of the accountants asked, clearly impressed despite himself. "March 14th, Emily said. 3 years ago. Richard almost lost that deal because he oversold the timeline. I stepped in during the break and reframed the projections before they came back from lunch." "That's not in any of the official minutes." "No," Emily said quietly. "It wouldn't be." The accountant made a note, and Emily watched him do it, feeling something strange settle over her. Not quite satisfaction, not quite vindication, but something adjacent to both. For years, she had wondered if she'd imagined her own value, if she'd exaggerated in her own mind how much she'd actually contributed. Now she was watching professionals document it line by line as undeniable fact. Patricia Reyes appeared in the doorway partway through the session, her expression tight. "Emily, can I borrow you for a moment?" Emily excused herself and followed Patricia into the hallway. "What is it?" "Richard wants a meeting," Patricia said. "He's requested it formally through his lawyer. Says he wants to talk to you directly before the investigation goes any further." Emily felt her stomach tighten. "About what?" "He didn't say. But Emily—" Patricia hesitated. "You don't have to see him. Nothing requires it. If you'd rather he go through legal channels, only that's completely your right." Emily considered this for a long moment. Part of her wanted to refuse outright, to let Richard sit in the discomfort of never getting to explain himself to her face. But another part of her, quieter, more stubborn, wanted to look him in the eye one more time, now that the balance between them had shifted so completely. "I'll see him," she said finally, "but not alone, and not here." 2 days later, Emily sat in a private meeting room at a downtown hotel, Margaret seated beside her, a folder of documents between them like a wall neither of them needed to build, but both understood was necessary. Richard arrived exactly on time, looking noticeably thinner than he had at the courthouse only weeks earlier. His usual polish replaced by something more haggard, more human. "Thank you for agreeing to this," he said, sitting down across from her. "I didn't agree for your sake," Emily said evenly. Richard nodded slowly, absorbing that without argument. "That's fair." There was a long silence before he spoke again. "I've spent the last 2 weeks going through everything," he said. "The board's investigation, the financial records, things I apparently didn't fully understand about my own company, which I realize is an insane thing to admit out loud." "What did you find?" Emily asked, though she suspected she already knew. "I found 7 years of you," Richard said quietly. "Everywhere. In every deal, every crisis, every moment where things could have collapsed and somehow didn't. I found your handwriting in the margins of contracts I don't even remember you reading. I found emails you sent advisors using my name because I asked you to, because I told you it would look better coming from me." Emily said nothing, letting him continue. "I built an entire identity on being a man who did this alone," Richard said, his voice cracking slightly. "And every single piece of evidence in that investigation says I never did anything alone at all." "No," Emily said quietly. "You didn't." Richard looked up at her, something raw and exposed in his expression. "Why didn't you ever push back? Why didn't you ever demand credit, demand recognition, demand something for what you were doing?" Emily was quiet for a moment, turning the question over carefully before answering. "Because I thought that's what love looked like," she said finally. "Support without conditions, help without expecting anything back. I thought if I gave enough quietly enough, eventually you'd see it on your own, and it would mean more than if I'd forced you to. And instead, you got so used to me giving without asking that you stopped noticing I was giving at all," Emily said, "until eventually, in your mind, there was nothing there to notice." Richard flinched as if she'd struck him. "I'm not telling you this to hurt you," Emily continued, her voice steady, despite the weight of the words. "I'm telling you because you asked, and because I think for the first time in 7 years, you're actually ready to hear it." Richard put his head in his hands briefly, and when he looked up again, his eyes were wet. "I don't know how to fix this." "You can't," Emily said simply. "Not the marriage. That's over, Richard. It ended the moment you stopped seeing me as someone worth looking at." "Then why is any of this happening?" Richard asked, gesturing vaguely encompassing the investigation, the board, everything unraveling around him. "If not to fix things, if not to punish me, what is the point?" Margaret spoke for the first time, her voice calm and professional. "The point, Richard, is accountability. Not because Emily demanded it, but because it was always going to happen eventually. You built a company on a foundation you never fully owned, and foundations like that don't hold indefinitely. Emily's involvement simply meant it happened sooner and hopefully more carefully than it otherwise would have." Richard absorbed that, nodding, slowly defeated. "The board is going to vote on my removal next week," he said quietly. "Formally, permanently." "I know," Emily said. "Did you push for that?" "No," Emily said honestly. "I told them I wanted accountability, not destruction. What happens from here is between you and the board, and honestly between you and the choices you made long before I ever walked into that courthouse." Richard sat in silence for a long moment before finally speaking again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I loved you, Emily, even when I was terrible at showing it. Even when I let Vanessa in, even when I stopped introducing you by your name, I loved you. I don't expect you to believe that. I'm not sure I even believe it fully myself, given everything. But I need you to know I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I stopped knowing how to sit with how much I owed you." Emily studied him for a long moment, feeling something complicated move through her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but something quieter, more resigned. "I believe that you believe that," she said finally. "But love that only shows up when it's convenient, Richard, isn't really love. It's comfort. And I spent 7 years mistaking one for the other." She stood gathering the folder in front of her, and for a moment Richard looked as though he might reach for her hand, might try one final time to bridge a distance that both of them now understood could never be closed. He didn't. "Goodbye, Richard," Emily said quietly, and walked out of the room without looking back. Meanwhile, across town, Vanessa Cole sat in her apartment, staring at her own phone, at a message from a friend inside the company that had arrived only minutes earlier. "They're saying the board might dissolve your position entirely once Richard's officially out. Something about conflicts of interest tied to the restructuring." Vanessa's hands trembled as she read it again. She had spent months positioning herself carefully, calculating every move, believing that if she simply waited long enough, the life Emily had built would eventually become hers by default. She had never imagined a scenario where the entire structure collapsed before she ever got the chance to claim it. Her phone rang. Richard's name flashed across the screen. She almost didn't answer. "Richard," she said finally, "what's happening?" "I just met with Emily," Richard said, his voice hollow. And I finally understood something I should have understood years ago," Richard said. "None of this is coming back, Vanessa. Not the company, not my position, not—" He paused. "Not any of it." "What does that mean for us?" Vanessa asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. Richard was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know if there is an us, Vanessa. Not really. I think we were always just two people convenient for each other at exactly the wrong moment." Vanessa's throat tightened. "You're ending things. Now. When everything is falling apart." "I'm not ending anything," Richard said quietly. "I'm just finally being honest about what it was in the first place." He hung up before she could respond, and Vanessa sat alone in her apartment, staring at the phone in her hand, realizing with dawning horror that in trying to take Emily's place, she had ended up with nothing at all. Not the company, not the man, not even the illusion of the life she'd thought she was building. Back at the Vale estate, Emily returned late that evening, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. Alexander was waiting for her in the study, a cup of tea already prepared. "How did it go?" he asked. "Exactly the way I expected it to," Emily said, sitting down heavily. "He apologized. He cried a little. He asked me why I never fought for recognition." "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Emily said, "that I thought love meant giving without asking for anything back, and that somewhere along the way he mistook my silence for permission to take everything I gave and act like he'd built it alone." Alexander nodded slowly. "How do you feel now that it's said?" Emily considered the question honestly. "Lighter," she admitted. "Not happy, not triumphant, just lighter, like I finally put down something I'd been carrying so long I forgot it had weight." "That's not nothing," Alexander said. "No," Emily agreed. "It's not." Over the following days, the investigation into Lawson Technologies accelerated, each revelation landing like another crack, spreading through what had once looked like an unshakable empire. Financial irregularities, misrepresented investor relationships, a pattern thoroughly documented now of decisions made to protect Richard's image rather than the company's actual health. The board convened for a final vote on a Thursday morning, and Emily sat in the room as an advisor, watching the process unfold with a strange, hollow sense of finality. All those in favor of removing Richard Lawson as founder and CEO, effective immediately. Douglas Whitfield set his voice steady and formal. Hands rose around the table one after another until the vote was unanimous. "The motion carries," Douglas said quietly. "Richard Lawson is hereby removed from all executive positions within Lawson Technologies." There was no cheering, no triumphant applause, just the quiet, weighted silence of people who understood they had just ended something that had once seemed permanent. Richard wasn't in the room to hear it. He'd chosen, at his lawyer's advice, not to attend. Emily learned later that he received the news by email, sitting alone in his apartment, staring at a message that formally ended 7 years of building an identity around a company that in the end had never truly been his alone to claim. That evening, a reporter reached out to Emily, directly requesting a statement for a major follow-up story that was already being prepared for publication. "They want a quote," Patricia said, relaying the request. "Something about how it feels to watch your ex-husband lose everything you helped him build." Emily thought about it carefully before responding. "Tell them this," she said finally. "I didn't do this to watch him lose everything. I did this because for 7 years the truth was hidden, and hidden truths don't stay buried forever. What happened to Richard wasn't punishment. It was simply what happens when foundations built on erasure finally give way." Patricia nodded, writing the quote down carefully. "That's remarkably composed given everything." "I've had a lot of practice being composed," Emily said quietly. "I'm trying to learn what it feels like to be honest instead." The story ran the next morning, and within hours, Emily's quote had spread far beyond the business press that had originally covered it. People who had never heard of Lawson Technologies before found themselves reading about a quiet wife erased from her own success, a woman who had chosen accountability over revenge, even when revenge had been well within her reach. Comments flooded in, messages from strangers, women mostly writing to say they saw themselves in her story, years spent supporting someone else's dream, while their own contributions disappeared quietly into someone else's narrative. Emily read a handful of the messages late one night, sitting alone in her old childhood bedroom, and found herself crying for the first time since the divorce, not from sadness, but from something that felt startlingly close to recognition. She wasn't the only woman who had made herself smaller for someone else's comfort. She wasn't the only one who had mistaken silence for strength until the weight of it became unbearable. She wasn't alone. That realization, more than anything Alexander's money or influence could offer her, felt like the beginning of something entirely new. A week later, Emily sat in Douglas Whitfield's office, the interim leadership team having requested a formal meeting to discuss the company's path forward. "We'd like to offer you the permanent position," Douglas said, without preamble. "Not interim advisor, CEO." Emily blinked, momentarily caught off guard, despite everything that had already happened. "Me? You, Emily?" Douglas said. "You know this company's history better than anyone left standing. You have the trust of the investors who remain largely because your name is now synonymous with the accountability that saved this company from complete collapse. And frankly, most of us believe you should have had this position years ago." Emily sat with the offer for a long moment, feeling the shape of an entirely different life opening up in front of her. Not the quiet, invisible wife she had spent 7 years being, not even simply the hidden heiress, reclaiming her name, but something new entirely. Something she would have to build for herself on her own terms, without anyone else's shadow to hide inside. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Take the time you need," Douglas said. "But Emily, I hope you understand what this offer represents. It's not charity. It's not sympathy for what happened to you. It's simply recognition long overdue of what you're actually capable of." Emily left the meeting in a daze, walking through the halls of the company that had once made her feel so completely invisible, now offering her the very seat at the head of the table that had once belonged to the man who erased her. She thought about calling Alexander immediately, then decided against it. This was a decision she realized that she needed to sit with alone first. Not because she didn't trust her family's guidance, but because for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wanted to know what she thought before anyone else weighed in. She drove instead to a small park near the edge of the city, sat on a bench overlooking the water, and allowed herself finally to simply think. She thought about the woman she'd been at the courthouse, calm and composed, signing away 7 years without a single tear. She thought about the woman in the SUV, trembling slightly as she read through evidence of exactly how thoroughly she'd been erased. She thought about the woman sitting across from Richard in that hotel meeting room, finally saying aloud everything she'd spent years swallowing. And she thought about the woman she could become if she said yes to this. Not Richard's wife, not simply Alexander's sister, not even purely the veil heiress the headlines had already turned her into. Just Emily, building something entirely her own for the first time in her adult life. Her phone rang, breaking her concentration. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Is this Emily Vale?" a woman's voice asked, unfamiliar, hesitant. "Yes," Emily said carefully. "Who is this?" "My name is Sarah Chen," the woman said. "I used to work in your and Richard's company 3 years ago. I left after—" she paused. "After some things happened that I never felt comfortable reporting." Emily sat up straighter. "What kind of things?" "Financial things," Sarah said. "Similar to what's coming out now, but earlier. Different deal. I tried to raise concerns and got quietly pushed out instead. I've been watching the news and I thought maybe now someone would actually listen." Emily closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of yet another thread connected to the same unraveling story. "I'm listening," she said quietly. "Tell me everything." As Sarah began to speak, Emily realized with a growing uneasy certainty that the investigation into Richard's company was far from over, that the damage went back further and ran deeper than even the forensic accountants had yet uncovered. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a question began to form that she hadn't let herself consider fully until this moment. If Richard had been hiding this much for this long, who else inside that company had known and said nothing? Sarah Chen's voice trembled slightly as she continued, and Emily gripped the phone tighter, sensing that whatever came next was going to reshape everything she thought she already understood about Richard's company. 3 years ago, there was a smaller deal, Sarah said, before Meridian, a partnership with a logistics firm called Brenmark. I was handling the financial modeling, and the numbers Richard presented to investors didn't match what I was seeing internally. When I brought it to him directly, he told me I'd misread the spreadsheets. Had you? Emily asked carefully. No, Sarah said, her voice hardening. I hadn't. I went to HR about it 2 weeks later. Within a month, I was let go for what they called performance concerns. I'd never had a single negative review before that conversation. Emily felt something cold settle in her chest. You're saying he silenced you? I'm saying, Sarah said, that I wasn't the only one who tried. There was a man in finance, Marcus Webb, who raised similar concerns around the same time. He left too. Different reason on paper, same pattern underneath. Emily closed her eyes, absorbing the shape of what was forming in front of her. Not one isolated mistake, not even a single pattern of quiet erasure, but something closer to a system, a method, a way of operating that had apparently existed long before she'd ever stopped being useful enough to protect. Would you be willing to speak with our investigators? Emily asked. Formally, on the record. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I was scared to say anything for 3 years, Sarah admitted. I watched what happened to people who pushed back against him. But watching the news this week, watching you walk back into that company and actually ask questions... She paused again. Yeah, I'll talk to them. It's time somebody did. After the call ended, Emily sat motionless on the park bench for a long moment, staring out at the water without really seeing it. She thought about Richard's face across the hotel table, days earlier, the tears, the apology that had sounded in the moment almost sincere. Now she wondered how much of that sincerity had been real, and how much had simply been the performance of a man who understood finally that he'd run out of other options. She called Margaret immediately. There's more, Emily said without preamble. Older, deeper than the Meridian deal. Margaret's voice sharpened instantly. Tell me everything. Emily relayed the conversation carefully, watching as even over the phone she could practically hear Margaret's mind working through the implications. If this checks out, Margaret said finally, we're not looking at a single instance of financial misrepresentation anymore. We're looking at a pattern of silencing employees who raised legitimate concerns. That's a different category of liability entirely. What does that mean for the investigation? It means it's about to get significantly larger, Margaret said, and it means Richard's exposure just increased substantially. This isn't just about restructuring the company anymore, Emily. Depending on what your investigators find, this could move into criminal territory. Emily absorbed that slowly. I told you both I didn't want him destroyed. I remember, Margaret said gently. But Emily, if he silenced employees who tried to raise honest concerns protecting the company, now means exposing that fully, whether it aligns with your original intentions or not. Some things, once they're true, don't stay contained to the shape you originally wanted them to take. Emily sat with that for a long moment, feeling the ground shift again beneath a situation she thought she'd already come to terms with. Do it, she said finally. Follow it wherever it goes. 2 days later, the forensic team confirmed Sarah's account almost entirely. Marcus Webb, once located and interviewed, corroborated the pattern, independently describing his own termination in language eerily similar to Sarah's. A third former employee came forward shortly after having seen the story break in the news and finally feeling safe enough to speak. The picture that emerged was damning in a way that went far beyond financial mismanagement. Richard hadn't simply made mistakes and covered them up reactively. He had built over years a quiet system for eliminating anyone who threatened the narrative he'd constructed around himself, a system Emily herself had unknowingly been part of, protecting simply by staying silent about her own erasure for so long. The realization sat heavily with her. I let this happen, she said to Alexander one evening, sitting in the study with the growing stack of evidence spread across the table between them. Not directly, but by staying quiet for so long, by letting him believe silence was acceptable, I think I made it easier for him to silence other people too. You didn't create this pattern, Emily, Alexander said firmly. He did, long before he ever silenced you specifically. You were simply the person closest to him, which meant you absorbed the version of this behavior that looked like neglect rather than outright retaliation. That's a generous distinction. It's an accurate one, Alexander said. Don't confuse guilt with responsibility. You're allowed to feel sad about what you didn't see. You're not required to feel responsible for what he chose to do. Emily nodded slowly, though the weight of it didn't fully lift. The investigation's expanded scope reached the press within days, and this time the story shifted in tone entirely. What had begun as a scandal about hidden family wealth and a humiliating divorce transformed into something far more serious, a pattern of retaliation, silencing, and systemic dishonesty that painted Richard not merely as a man who had made poor decisions, but as someone who had actively harmed people to protect his own image. Former employees allege retaliation at Lawson Technologies amid fraud investigation. Richard read the headline standing in his kitchen, coffee growing cold in his hand, and felt something inside him finally completely collapse. His lawyer called within the hour. "We need to talk about criminal exposure," the lawyer said, his voice tight, with barely restrained urgency. "Richard, if even half of what's being alleged holds up, you're not just looking at civil liability anymore. You're looking at potential charges." Richard sat down heavily at his kitchen table. Charges. As in fraud. Potentially obstruction, depending on how the silencing pattern is characterized legally. This is serious, Richard. More serious than anything we've discussed so far. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the last remaining pieces of the life he'd built slip entirely out of his grasp. "What do I do?" he asked quietly. "Right now," his lawyer said, "you say nothing publicly. You let me handle communications, and you start preparing yourself for the possibility that this doesn't end quietly, no matter how much either of us wishes it would." Richard hung up the phone and sat alone in the silence of his kitchen, staring at nothing. Thinking about Sarah Chen and Marcus Webb names, he barely remembered employees he'd dismissed years ago, without a second thought. People whose lives he'd upended to protect a version of himself that was apparently never real to begin with. He thought about Emily, about the folder she must have seen, about the years she'd spent believing her silence was strength, never realizing that the same silence he'd taught her to accept had been the exact mechanism he'd used to bury anyone else who dared speak up. For the first time since the divorce, Richard didn't feel angry or afraid or even desperate to salvage what remained of his reputation. He felt ashamed, genuinely, completely ashamed, in a way he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Meanwhile, Emily sat across from Sarah Chen in person, for the first time having invited her to the Vale estate for a conversation that felt in some ways more important than any of the formal investigative interviews that had already taken place. "Thank you for coming," Emily said. "Thank you for listening," Sarah replied. "I wasn't sure anyone ever would." They sat together for nearly an hour, Sarah recounting details Emily hadn't yet heard, moments of quiet cruelty dressed up as routine business decisions, the particular exhaustion of trying to do the right thing inside a system built to punish exactly that. "I used to think I was crazy," Sarah admitted at one point. "Like maybe I really had misread the numbers, like maybe I really was too sensitive, too difficult. It took me years to trust my own memory of what actually happened." Emily felt something painfully familiar in that sentence. "I understand that more than you know," she said quietly. Sarah studied her for a moment. "Because of what happened with your marriage." Emily nodded slowly. "For 7 years, I second-guessed almost everything I contributed. I told myself I was imagining my own value, that maybe I really wasn't as important to the company as I felt like I was. It took an entire investigation, a folder full of documents, for me to finally believe what I already knew was true." "That's exactly it," Sarah said, her voice cracking slightly. "That's exactly what it felt like." "You weren't imagining it," Emily said firmly. "Either of us. Neither was Marcus. Neither were the others who are probably still too afraid to come forward." Sarah wiped her eyes, offering a small, grateful smile. "It helps hearing that from someone who understands." "It should never have taken this long," Emily said, "for either of us." After Sarah left, Emily sat alone in the study for a long while, turning the entire situation over in her mind. She thought about Douglas Whitfield's offer, still unanswered after nearly a week. She thought about the version of herself who had once believed staying quiet was the safest, kindest choice available to her. She thought about how wrong that belief had turned out to be, not just for her, but for every person who had learned watching Richard's behavior go consistently unchallenged, that speaking up simply wasn't worth the risk. That evening she called Douglas. "I'll take the position," she said. "CEO, full authority, but I want something in return." "Name it," Douglas said. "I want a formal policy overhaul," Emily said. "Whistleblower protections, independent review processes for any employee raising financial or ethical concerns. I want it built into the company's structure so deeply that no future leadership can quietly dismantle it the way Richard dismantled every safeguard that used to exist." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Done," Douglas said simply. "Frankly, Emily, I'd have been disappointed if you hadn't asked for exactly that." Emily allowed herself for the first time in weeks a small, genuine smile. "Then I accept," she said, officially. The following morning, Emily walked into Lawson Technologies, not as an advisor, not as a temporary presence brought in to manage a crisis, but as its chief executive officer, a title that only a month earlier would have seemed as impossible to her as the idea that she'd one day be publicly recognized as a Vail. The company's name changed within weeks, a decision Emily made deliberately carefully with input from the board, and notably from Sarah Chen and Marcus Webb, both of whom she'd quietly brought back on as consultants during the restructuring process. Vail Technologies. Not because Emily wanted her family's name attached to her success, but because she wanted every employee walking through those doors to understand unmistakably that the company they worked for now stood for something entirely different than it once had. Richard watched the announcement from a distance, scrolling through the news on a phone he checked far less obsessively now than he had in the weeks immediately following the divorce. He read about the policy changes, the whistleblower protections, the public apology issued not by him, but by the company itself, acknowledging the harm caused to former employees who had tried and failed to raise legitimate concerns. He thought about calling Emily, about apologizing again more fully this time, now that he understood the true scope of what he'd built and then destroyed. He didn't. He understood finally that some apologies arrived too late to mean anything beyond the comfort of the person offering them, and that Emily, having already said everything she needed to say in that hotel meeting room weeks earlier, didn't need to hear it again. Instead, he sat with the discomfort of his own choices day after day, slowly beginning the difficult, unglamorous work of understanding exactly how he had become a person capable of the things the investigation had uncovered. It wasn't redemption, not yet, and possibly not ever in any way that would fully balance the harm already done. But it was for the first time in years, honesty, the same quality he had spent so long avoiding in himself, now unavoidable sitting across from him every single day, whether he wanted to face it or not. Across the city, Emily stood in her new office, the same office Richard had once occupied, though she'd had it repainted, rearranged, stripped entirely of the version of the space that used to make her feel like a visitor in her own company. She looked out the window at the city stretching below, thinking about the woman who had walked into a courthouse weeks earlier, believing her only remaining option was to sign quietly and disappear. That woman felt distant now. Not gone entirely, Emily could still recognize pieces of her, the instinct toward quiet composure, the habit of swallowing discomfort rather than speaking it aloud. But underneath that familiar shape, something new had taken root. A woman who understood finally that her silence had never been a virtue. It had simply been a habit she hadn't yet learned to break. Her phone buzzed. A message from Alexander. "Proud of you, not for the company, for the version of yourself you're becoming while running it." Emily read the message twice, feeling something warm settle behind the exhaustion of the past month. She typed back a simple reply. "I'm still figuring out who that is." His response came quickly. "Good. That means you're finally allowed to." Emily set the phone down and looked back out at the city, at the life spreading out in front of her that she was for the very first time building entirely on her own terms. She didn't yet know exactly where it would lead. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't afraid to find out. 3 weeks into her position as CEO, Emily sat in a conference room reviewing the restructured onboarding materials when Patricia knocked softly on the open door. "There's someone here asking to see you," Patricia said, an odd note in her voice. "She doesn't have an appointment. Says her name is Diane Foster." Emily frowned slightly, the name unfamiliar. "Did she say what it's regarding?" "She said you'd want to hear it," Patricia said. She looked nervous, Emily. The kind of nervous that usually means something real. Emily set down her pen. "Send her in." Diane Foster turned out to be a woman in her late 50s, neatly dressed hands clasped tightly in front of her as she sat down across from Emily's desk. She looked like someone who had rehearsed this conversation many times in her head and was still not entirely sure she'd go through with it. "Thank you for seeing me," Diane said. "I used to work in accounts payable, almost 6 years ago now. What can I help you with, Diane?" Diane hesitated, glancing toward the door as though checking it was fully closed. "I've been watching the news, the investigation, the employees coming forward." She took a breath. "I think I might have something relevant, something older than what's already been found." Emily felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the particular anticipation of a thread about to unravel further than she was prepared for. "I'm listening." Before Richard founded this company independently, Diane said, he ran a smaller startup, 3-4 years before Lawson Technologies existed. It failed, badly. There were investors who lost significant money. Emily sat forward slightly. "I never heard about a previous company." "Most people haven't," Diane said. "He scrubbed almost every public reference to it once Lawson Technologies started gaining traction. I only know because I worked there too briefly before following him to the new venture." "What happened to it?" Diane's expression tightened. "Officially, it just ran out of funding. Standard startup failure story. Unofficially," she paused again, choosing her words carefully. "Unofficially, there were questions about where certain investor funds actually went in the final months before it collapsed. I never had proof, just suspicion, and a very strong instinct to keep my head down and move on with my career." Emily absorbed this slowly. "Why come forward now?" "Because I have a daughter who just graduated business school," Diane said, her voice thickening slightly. "And I keep thinking about what kind of example I'm setting if I stay quiet my entire career every single time something feels wrong. I was quiet once already. I don't want to be quiet twice." Emily nodded slowly, something in Diane's words landing with unexpected weight. She thought of her own 7 years of silence, the habit she was still in small ways learning to unlearn. "I'll have our investigators reach out to you formally," Emily said. "Whatever you remember, even if it feels incomplete or uncertain, write it down. Sometimes the smallest details end up mattering the most." Diane nodded, visibly relieved. "There's one more thing," she said, standing to leave. "The name of that earlier company. It was called Vantage Point Solutions. I don't know if it means anything to you, but given everything else that's come out, I thought you should have it." After Diane left, Emily sat motionless at her desk for a long time, staring at the name written on the notepad in front of her. Vantage Point Solutions. An entire chapter of Richard's history he had erased so thoroughly that even she, married to him for 7 years, had never once heard it mentioned. She thought about how much else might still be buried, waiting for the right person to finally feel safe enough to speak. She called Margaret immediately. "There's a third company," Emily said. "Before this one. Richard scrubbed it from public record." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant escalation, Emily. If investors lost money in a venture, he later concealed the existence of and used the proceeds or reputation from that concealment to help launch Lawson Technologies. It could mean the entire foundation of this company was built on something worse than I originally understood," Emily finished. "Potentially," Margaret said carefully. "I'll have the team pull public filings for Vantage Point Solutions immediately. If it existed and dissolved the way this woman describes, there should be some record, however buried." The records, when they surfaced 2 days later, confirmed everything Diane had described, and more. Vantage Point Solutions had indeed existed, had indeed collapsed under circumstances involving significant unaccounted investor funds, and had indeed dissolved quietly enough that its connection to Richard's later, far more successful venture had gone almost entirely unnoticed by the press and public alike. More troubling still, two of the investors who had lost money in Vantage Point's collapse were the very same investors Richard had later courted for Lawson Technologies investors. Emily herself had helped secure unknowingly, walking them directly back into business with the same man who had already cost them money once before. "I brought them back to him," Emily said quietly, staring at the documents spread across Alexander's study table that evening. "I made those introductions. If I'd known—" "You couldn't have known," Alexander said firmly. "He erased the connection specifically so no one would know, including you. This isn't your failure, Emily. This is the direct, deliberate result of his deception." "It still feels like my failure," Emily admitted, "like I was a tool he used without even realizing it." "You were," Alexander said, not unkindly. "That's exactly what he did to you in more ways than either of us initially understood. But recognizing that now and doing something about it is not a failure, it's the opposite of one." Emily sat with that for a long moment before nodding slowly. The revelation about Vantage Point Solutions broke publicly within the week, and this time the story shifted again. No longer simply a tale of hidden wealth or corporate mismanagement, but something that read increasingly like the unraveling of a man who had spent over a decade building his entire adult life on a foundation of calculated erasure. Lawson's hidden startup history raises new questions about pattern of investor deception. Richard's lawyer called him the morning the story broke, his voice tighter than Richard had ever heard it. "This changes things significantly," the lawyer said. "If prosecutors can establish a pattern going back over a decade, this isn't a single lapse in judgment anymore, Richard. This looks like a career built on it." Richard sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the words settling over him with a finality he could no longer talk his way around. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now," his lawyer said, "we prepare for the very real possibility of criminal charges. I need you to be completely honest with me about anything else I might not know yet. Because if there's a fourth thing waiting to surface, Richard, I need to hear it from you before I hear it from a reporter." Richard closed his eyes, memories surfacing he'd worked hard for years to bury even from himself. Smaller decisions, quieter compromises, each one individually justifiable in the moment, each one now forming a pattern so damning it made his chest ache to fully confront. "There might be one more thing," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. His lawyer exhaled sharply. "Tell me everything, now." At Vail Technologies, Emily called an all-staff meeting standing in front of employees who had spent years working under a leadership structure built on layers of concealment they'd had no way of knowing existed. "I know the news over the past month has been difficult to process," she said, her voice steady, despite the exhaustion visible beneath it. "I know many of you are wondering what kind of company you actually work for, and whether the ground beneath your careers is as stable as you once believed." The room was silent, attentive. "I can't promise you there won't be more difficult revelations," Emily continued honestly. "I can promise you that this company will face every single one of them directly, rather than burying them the way they were buried before. That's not a comfortable promise, but it's an honest one, and honest is what I intend for this company to be starting now." A hand rose near the back of the room. A young woman, clearly nervous, stood slowly. "How do we know this isn't just a better performance? A nicer version of the same thing?" Emily nodded, appreciating the directness of the question rather than being offended by it. "You don't know that yet," she said honestly. "Not from words alone. You'll know it from what happens the next time someone in this building raises a concern and whether they're protected or punished for raising it. That's the only proof that will actually mean anything. I intend to make sure it's proof you eventually see for yourselves." The young woman nodded slowly, sitting back down, seemingly satisfied, at least for now, with an answer that hadn't tried to oversell itself. After the meeting, Patricia approached Emily quietly. "That was well handled." "I don't know if it was enough," Emily admitted. "It doesn't need to be enough all at once," Patricia said. "Trust doesn't rebuild in a single meeting, Emily. You know that better than anyone." Emily nodded slowly, thinking of her own long, slow journey toward finally trusting her own value again, a journey that was, she realized, still very much ongoing even now. That evening back at the Vale estate, Emily received a message from Sarah Chen, now working alongside the investigative team as a consultant. Diane's information checked out completely. There's something else, though. Might want to sit down before you read the next part. Emily's stomach tightened as she opened the attached summary scanning, quickly through details of yet another thread the investigators had uncovered, smaller but no less troubling, connected loosely to the same pattern of concealment that seemed to spread further every time someone pulled at a single loose end. She set the phone down slowly, staring out at the darkened grounds beyond her window, and allowed herself just for a moment to feel the full exhaustion of everything the past month had demanded of her. Then she picked the phone back up and began once again to read. Emily read Sarah's summary twice before she fully absorbed what it meant. Buried inside a secondary contract from 4 years earlier was a clause that redirected a small percentage of investor returns into an account that traced, after several layers of obfuscation, back to a shell entity Richard had quietly controlled. Not enormous, not the kind of number that would have triggered alarms on its own, but deliberate, precise. The kind of thing only someone actively trying to skim value without detection would think to build. She called Margaret immediately, even though it was well past 10 at night. "I'm sorry for the hour," Emily said. "Don't apologize," Margaret said. "Tell me." Emily read through the details slowly, watching in her mind as Margaret's silence on the other end grew heavier with every sentence. "This is different from everything else," Margaret said finally. The other issues were mismanagement, concealment, retaliation, serious but arguably explainable as a pattern of protecting his image. This is something else. This is deliberate skimming, structured specifically to avoid detection. Which means what legally? Which means, Margaret said carefully, we've moved from a company that misrepresented itself into a company whose founder was actively stealing from the people who trusted him. That's not a gray area anymore, Emily. That's theft. Emily sat with the word for a long moment, feeling it settle into her chest with a kind of finality the earlier revelations hadn't quite carried. "I need to call Alexander," she said. "I'd also strongly recommend contacting federal regulators directly at this point," Margaret said. "Not to escalate for its own sake, Emily, because at this level, protecting the company means bringing in people with authority the board simply doesn't have." Emily nodded to herself in the dark, quiet wait of her office. "Do it. Tonight if you can." The following morning, 2 federal investigators arrived at Vale Technologies, and for the first time since the divorce, Emily felt the full, undeniable scope of what she had walked into. This wasn't simply corporate restructuring anymore. This was becoming something far larger than any of them had originally anticipated, a case study potentially in exactly how far one man's need to appear infallible could travel before it finally collapsed under its own weight. Richard was formally notified by his lawyer that afternoon. "They're opening a federal inquiry," the lawyer said, his voice carefully neutral, in the way lawyers speak when they're delivering news they know will be devastating. "Richard, I need you to understand what this means. This isn't the board anymore. This isn't even civil litigation. This is federal." Richard sat in silence on the other end of the line for so long his lawyer eventually said his name, twice checking he was still there. "I'm here," Richard finally said, his voice hollow. "We need to discuss cooperation," the lawyer continued. "At this stage, the best path forward realistically involves full transparency. Fighting this on every front isn't a winning strategy anymore. It's just delaying an outcome that's going to arrive either way." Richard closed his eyes. "You're telling me to just confess to everything?" "I'm telling you," his lawyer said, "that the version of yourself who thought he could manage this by controlling the narrative doesn't exist as an option anymore. Emily's investigation, and now the federal one, have already found nearly everything there is to find. The only choice left is whether you're the one who finally tells the truth or whether you're the last person to admit it." Richard sat with that for a long time after the call ended, staring at nothing, feeling something inside him finally completely give way, not in anger, not even in fear anymore, but in something closer to surrender. He thought about Emily, about the quiet, steady way she had once supported him through every crisis, never once asking for credit, never once demanding he see her clearly in return. He thought about how thoroughly he had mistaken that steadiness for weakness, how completely he had convinced himself that a woman who gave without asking must simply have nothing worth asking for. He had built an entire empire on being underestimated by no one except the one person who actually deserved his full attention. And now that empire was gone. 2 days later, Richard requested one final meeting, not with lawyers present, not through formal channels, but a simple message sent directly to Emily's phone, a number he still had despite everything. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know that's not something I get to ask for anymore. I just need 5 minutes. After that, I promise I won't reach out again." Emily stared at the message for a long time before responding. "Tomorrow. 10 minutes. Not one more." They met the next morning in a small coffee shop near the courthouse, the same courthouse Emily realized only after she'd already agreed to the location where everything had begun weeks earlier. Richard looked different than he had even during their hotel meeting, thinner still, older somehow in a way that had nothing to do with actual time passing. He sat down across from her, hands wrapped around a coffee cup he clearly wasn't drinking. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "You have 10 minutes, Emily reminded him, though her voice carried less edge than it might have weeks earlier. Richard nodded, gathering himself. "I'm cooperating fully with the investigation. Federal board, all of it. My lawyer thinks I'll likely face some form of restitution, possibly probation, depending on how the sentencing guidelines apply. I don't know yet exactly what my life looks like after this." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know it from me," Richard said. "Not from a headline, not from a press release. I owe you that much, even if it's far too little, far too late." Emily studied him for a long moment. "Okay, you've told me." "There's something else," Richard said, his voice tightening. "I've been thinking a lot these past few weeks about the version of myself who married you. The version who used to actually listen when you talked before success made me arrogant enough to stop." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I don't know if that version of me is still in here somewhere or if he's just gone completely. But I wanted you to know that I see it now. All of it. Not because the investigation forced me to, because I finally let myself." Emily felt something complicated move through her chest. Not forgiveness, not quite, but something that resembled closure, the particular relief of finally hearing someone acknowledge a truth she had spent years being told she was imagining. "I believe you," she said finally. "I believe that you see it now. I just wish it hadn't taken losing everything for you to actually look." "Me too," Richard said quietly. They sat in silence for a moment before Emily stood gathering her coat. "I hope you rebuild something honest, Richard," she said. "I mean that, not for my sake. For whoever comes after this, the people who work with you, if anyone still does, the people who trust you if you ever earn that back. Don't let them learn what I learned the hard way." Richard nodded slowly, something in his expression suggesting he understood finally completely exactly what she meant. "Goodbye, Emily," he said. "Goodbye, Richard," she replied, and walked out of the coffee shop into the late morning light, feeling for the first time in weeks like she had finally closed a door she no longer needed to keep checking behind her. The federal investigation concluded 4 months later. Richard pleaded guilty to multiple counts of securities fraud and wire fraud, avoiding a lengthy trial in exchange for full cooperation and substantial restitution payments to the investors harmed across both Vantage Point Solutions and Lawson Technologies. He received a sentence that included probation, significant financial penalties, and a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any public company. Vanessa Cole, it turned out, had known more about the Meridian cover-up than she'd ever admitted to Richard directly. Her own position at the company had already been quietly terminated months earlier, and she disappeared from the public narrative almost entirely, her name surfacing only briefly in follow-up articles that most readers skimmed past without much interest. She had wanted more than anything Emily's old life, and in the end, she'd ended up with nothing that had ever truly been real to begin with. Emily, meanwhile, spent those same 4 months rebuilding Vail Technologies into something unrecognizable from the company Richard had once run. Whistleblower protections were not simply written into policy, but tested publicly when a mid-level manager raised concerns about a vendor contract and was, for the first time in the company's history, protected rather than punished for speaking up. Emily made sure the story reached every employee, not as propaganda, but as proof. The exact kind of proof the young woman in that early staff meeting had said she needed to see before she'd trust anything Emily promised. The company's growth surprised even the board. Investors who had initially fled during the scandal slowly returned, drawn not by Richard's old promises of visionary disruption, but by something quieter and ultimately far more valuable, a reputation for radical honesty in an industry that had grown accustomed to expecting anything but. 6 months after the courthouse, Emily stood at a podium at an industry conference, invited to speak on corporate accountability, a topic she would have found almost laughably ironic a year earlier, back when she'd been the quiet woman standing silently beside someone else's success. "I used to believe," she told the audience, her voice steady and clear, carrying none of the hesitation that had once defined her public presence, "that staying quiet was a form of strength. That supporting someone without asking for recognition made me generous, patient good. It took losing everything I thought I had to understand that silence, when it's not a choice but a habit, isn't strength at all. It's just erosion happening so slowly you don't notice until there's nothing left of yourself to reclaim." The room was completely silent, every face turned toward her. "I'm not standing here today because a billionaire's jet showed up outside a courthouse," she continued. "That's the part of my story people remember because it's dramatic, because it looks like a fairy tale rescue. But that jet didn't save me. It just showed the world something that had already been true about me for years, something I had simply stopped believing myself." She paused, letting the words settle. "The real change happened long before that. It happened in 100 small moments where I chose to stay quiet instead of speaking up, and then eventually in one single moment where I finally chose not to. That choice is available to every single person in this room right now, regardless of whether there's a jet waiting outside for you or not." The applause that followed was immediate, sustained, and entirely unlike anything Emily had experienced during her 7 years as Richard Lawson's quiet, unremarkable wife. Afterward, a young woman approached her near the exit, visibly nervous, clutching a notebook against her chest. "Ms. Vale," she said, "I just wanted to say I've been working at a company for 2 years now where I feel exactly like you described, invisible, like my ideas only matter when someone else says them first." Emily looked at her, carefully recognizing something achingly familiar in the young woman's expression. "What's your name?" Emily asked. "Rachel," the young woman said. "Rachel," Emily said gently. "The version of you that's staying quiet right now to keep the peace, she's not protecting herself. She's just delaying the moment she finally has to fight for the space she deserves. I spent 7 years delaying that moment. Don't spend 7 years the way I did." Rachel's eyes welled up slightly. "How did you finally do it? Speak up, I mean after so long." Emily considered the question carefully. "Honestly, I didn't do it gracefully. I didn't do it because I woke up one day feeling brave. I did it because I was finally standing in a moment where staying silent would have cost me more than speaking up ever could. I'd encourage you not to wait for a moment that dramatic. Find your own reason on your own timeline before life forces one on you." Rachel nodded slowly, tucking that away, and Emily watched her walk off into the crowd with something that felt unmistakably like hope. Later that evening, Emily sat with Alexander on the terrace of the Vale estate, the city lights glittering faintly in the distance beyond the grounds. "You gave a hell of a speech today," Alexander said, handing her a glass of wine. "I meant every word of it," Emily said. "I know," Alexander said. "That's exactly why it landed the way it did." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence Emily had learned slowly to distinguish from the silence she used to live inside, not an absence of voice, but simply a peace that no longer required filling. "Do you ever think about him?" Alexander asked eventually. "Richard, I mean." Emily considered the question honestly. "Less than I expected to," she admitted. "I think about the years I spent with him sometimes, not with anger anymore mostly, just with a kind of distant sadness, like remembering someone I used to be rather than someone I still love." That sounds healthy, Alexander said. It took a long time to get here, Emily said. Longer than the headlines make it look. People see the courthouse, the jet, the company, the investigation. They think it all happened in some dramatic sweep. They don't see the months afterward, where I still woke up some mornings wondering if I'd imagined my own worth for 7 years. That part doesn't make for as good a headline. No, Alexander agreed, but it's the part that actually matters. Emily nodded slowly, looking out at the lights spread across the distant city. The same city where she had once walked out of a courthouse, believing she had lost everything, only to discover slowly and painfully, and then finally, with real clarity, that she had actually been given the chance to find herself for the very first time. A year after the divorce, Emily returned to that same courthouse, not for legal reasons this time, but simply because she wanted to. She stood in the same hallway where she had once signed away 7 years of her life without a single tear, and found that the space felt entirely different now, not because the building had changed, but because she had. A journalist recognizing her approached carefully. "Ms. Vale, would you mind if I asked you a few questions for a follow-up piece 1 year later?" Emily considered it, then nodded. "A few." "People still talk about the day Alexander Vale's SUV pulled up outside this courthouse," the journalist said. "Some call it the most dramatic rescue story of the year. Was that moment really the turning point people imagine it to be?" Emily smiled slightly, thinking of the speech she'd given months earlier, the same question phrased slightly differently. "No," she said honestly. "The jet, the SUV, my brother's arrival, that was just the moment the world found out something true about me. The real turning point happened earlier, quieter, when I signed those divorce papers and realized I wasn't going to fall apart the way everyone expected me to. That was the actual moment everything changed. Everyone just needed a more cinematic scene to notice it." The journalist smiled, jotting the quote down carefully. "One final question. If you could go back and say something to the version of yourself sitting in that meeting, signing those papers, what would you tell her?" Emily was quiet for a long moment, genuinely considering the question, rather than reaching for something easy. "I'd tell her that her silence was never proof of her strength," she said finally. "It was proof of how much she'd learned to shrink herself to keep peace with someone who never deserved that sacrifice. I'd tell her the version of herself waiting on the other side of that courthouse door was going to be more powerful, more honest, and more completely herself than she'd ever allowed herself to imagine. And I'd tell her not to be afraid of how loud that version of her turns out to be." The journalist thanked her, and Emily walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon light, feeling for the first time in longer than she could remember that she had finally answered every question that mattered, not for the story, not for the headlines, but for herself. Richard, from what little Emily heard through the occasional mutual acquaintance, had begun rebuilding a much smaller, much quieter life. No company, no headlines. Just a man slowly learning, apparently for the first time, what it meant to take responsibility rather than perform confidence. Whether he would ever truly change remained an open question, one Emily no longer felt any need to answer for him. Vale Technologies continued to grow, not despite its painful origins, but because of the radical honesty Emily had built directly into its foundation. Sarah Chen and Marcus Webb both remained with the company in senior roles, their earlier silencing transformed eventually into some of the company's most trusted voices. Diane Foster's daughter, the business school graduate her mother had thought of when finally coming forward, ended up interning at Vale Technologies the following summer, a small, quiet symmetry Emily noticed and appreciated more than she ever said aloud. And Emily herself, 2 years after the courthouse, stood once more before a room full of people, not explaining herself, not defending her right to exist in the space she now occupied, but simply leading fully and completely in a way that no longer required anyone's permission or recognition to feel real. She had spent 7 years believing that love meant disappearing quietly into someone else's success. She had spent one impossible day discovering that the world she thought she'd lost had actually been waiting all along for her to finally choose herself. And she had spent every day since proving deliberately and completely that a woman who learns to stop shrinking herself doesn't just survive what tried to erase her. She becomes impossible to ignore ever again. 3 years after this courthouse, Emily found herself invited to speak at a small gathering that had nothing to do with business, nothing to do with corporate accountability or investor relations. A women's shelter in Seattle, one of the smaller organizations her foundation quietly supported, had asked if she would come speak to a room of women rebuilding their lives after leaving relationships that had in various ways taught them the same lesson she had learned far more publicly than most. She almost said no, speaking about strategy restructuring corporate ethics that had become comfortable territory for her. Speaking about love, about what she had actually lost and actually learned, felt like standing in front of a room without any armor at all. She said yes anyway. The room was small, nothing like the conference halls she usually addressed. Maybe 30 women sitting in folding chairs, some holding coffee cups with both hands, like the warmth was the only thing keeping them steady. Emily looked at their faces and recognized something in almost every one of them, not their specific stories, which she didn't know, but the particular exhaustion of women who had spent years making themselves smaller for someone who never once asked them to grow. "I'm not going to talk about my company today," she began. "I'm not going to talk about the investigation or the headlines or any of the things people usually want to ask me about. I want to talk about something harder. I want to talk about what I got wrong about love for 7 years, because I think a lot of you already know exactly what I mean." A few women shifted in their seats. One near the back nodded slowly before Emily had even finished the sentence. "For most of my marriage," Emily continued, "I believed that real love meant giving without needing anything back. I thought if I loved someone enough, quietly enough, patiently enough, eventually they would see everything I was giving, and it would mean more than if I'd ever asked for it directly. I thought that was maturity. I thought that was selflessness. I thought that made me a good wife." She paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. "What I actually learned, eventually painfully, is that love without reciprocity isn't selflessness. It's imbalance. And imbalance, if you let it continue long enough, doesn't stay stable. It doesn't hold. It just tips further and further in one direction until the person doing all the giving disappears entirely, and the person doing all the taking doesn't even notice, because they've never had to notice. They've never had to work for anything, so they've forgotten that love is supposed to require work from both people, not just patience from one." One of the women in the front row spoke up, her voice tentative. "How do you tell the difference, though, between real patience and just disappearing?" Emily considered the question seriously, because it was, she realized, the exact question she had spent years failing to ask herself. "I think the difference is whether the patience is temporary or permanent," she said. "There's a version of patience that makes sense, giving someone room to grow, to make mistakes, to become better slowly instead of all at once. That's healthy. That's part of loving anyone imperfect, which is every single person alive. But there's another version of patience that isn't really patience at all. It's just waiting indefinitely for someone to finally treat you the way you deserve without ever telling them what that looks like, without ever holding them accountable for getting there. That's not love. That's hope dressed up as love, and hope alone was never going to build me a marriage that actually saw me." The room was quiet, absorbing that. "I used to think that asking for recognition made love conditional," Emily continued. "Like real love shouldn't need proof, shouldn't need acknowledgement, shouldn't need anyone to actually say the words out loud. But I don't believe that anymore. I think real love isn't diminished by being seen. I think real love actually requires it. If someone loves you and can't be bothered to notice what you're giving them, that's not deep love quietly expressing itself. That's just someone comfortable enough with your silence to never have to examine what they're taking from it." A woman near the middle of the room, older than most of the others, spoke up quietly. "What about forgiveness? You forgave him, didn't you? At least enough to sit with him those last few times." Emily nodded slowly. "I did forgive him, eventually. Not because he earned it in some grand, dramatic way. Not because the investigation somehow balanced the scales. I forgave him because I realized carrying that anger indefinitely was just another version of the same thing I'd already spent 7 years doing, shrinking myself to accommodate someone else's presence in my life, even in his absence. Holding on to rage that specifically for that long would have meant Richard was still controlling how much space I allowed myself to occupy, even after the marriage ended. But forgiveness didn't mean I forgot," she added. "And it definitely didn't mean I went back. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't the same thing as reconciliation. You can release someone from your anger without releasing them back into your life. Those are two completely different decisions, and I think a lot of us get taught, especially women my age, that they're supposed to be the same thing. They're not. I forgave Richard for my own peace. I didn't forgive him a place back inside my life because that was never his to have again. Several women nodded, some visibly moved one, wiping her eyes quickly before anyone could notice. "Can I ask something harder?" the same older woman said. "Do you think you'll ever love someone again after everything?" Emily took a moment before answering, genuinely considering the question rather than reaching for a rehearsed response. "I hope so," she said finally, "but differently than before. I think the version of me that got married at 28 believed love was something you earned by being endlessly agreeable, endlessly undemanding, endlessly easy to be around. I don't believe that anymore. I think real love, if it ever finds me again, is going to look like two people who actually ask each other hard questions. Two people who notice each other out loud, regularly, not just in some vague, understood way that never actually gets said. I used to think needing that made me difficult. Now I think anyone who makes you feel difficult for needing to be truly seen was never actually capable of loving you the way you deserved in the first place." The room sat with that for a long moment, the kind of silence that carries weight rather than emptiness. "I want to say one more thing," Emily continued, "and then I'll take whatever questions you have, because I know most of you didn't come here for a speech. You came here because you're in the middle of your own version of what I went through, and maybe some of you are still deciding whether to leave or how, or whether you even have the right to." She looked around the room slowly, meeting as many eyes as she could. "You have the right," she said firmly. "Whatever your version of the courthouse looks like, whether it's a literal divorce or just a conversation you've been avoiding or a decision you've been putting off because it feels too big, too disruptive, too selfish, you have the right to stop making yourself smaller to protect someone else's comfort. I spent 7 years believing my silence was a gift I was giving the people I loved. It wasn't a gift. It was a debt I kept paying without anyone ever asking me to, and the interest on that debt was my own sense of self disappearing a little more every single year. The version of me who finally stopped paying that debt didn't do it gracefully," she added. "I didn't do it with a plan or a strategy, or even much confidence, honestly. I just reached a moment where staying silent cost more than speaking up ever could, and I chose the door instead of the silence. That's really all it takes, not courage exactly. Just a moment where you finally let the cost of staying be more real to you than the fear of leaving." A young woman near the front, who hadn't spoken the entire session, finally raised her hand. "What if there's no jet waiting outside for us?" she asked quietly, and a soft, understanding laugh rippled through the room. "What if we walk out that door, and there's no big reveal, no fortune, no brother in a black SUV? What if it's just us alone figuring it out?" Emily smiled gently, recognizing the real fear underneath the question. "There was no jet for me either," she said. "Not really. That's the part people forget about my story because the jet makes for a better headline. But the actual jet didn't save me. I had already signed those papers. I had already made the decision to walk away before I had any idea what was waiting for me outside. The jet just happened to arrive after I'd already done the hardest part myself." She paused, letting that land fully. "Most of you aren't going to have a billionaire brother pull up outside your courthouse," Emily said more gently now. "Neither did I, not really. I had a brother, yes, but I had no idea he was coming, and I signed those papers believing I had genuinely lost everything. I want you to hear that clearly. I made the decision to leave without any guarantee of what came next. That's what most people who leave difficult situations actually have to do. No jet, no rescue. Just the decision itself made because staying had finally become more painful than not knowing what came after. And here's what I've learned since then," she continued. "The jet was never the point of my story. The point was that I stopped waiting to be rescued and started rescuing myself first. Everything else, the company, the recognition, even the money, that was just what happened to follow. It's not what made the decision to leave worth it. The decision to leave was worth it the moment I made it, regardless of what came after." The room was silent for a long moment, and then the older woman near the middle spoke again, her voice thick with something that sounded almost like relief. "Thank you," she said simply, "for saying it wasn't just luck, for saying we don't need a jet." "You don't," Emily said firmly. "You need exactly what I needed, the decision. Everything after that is just life responding to a choice you already had the strength to make." As the session ended and women began filing out, several of them stopped to speak with Emily individually. Quiet exchanges, brief and private. The kind of conversations that never make it into news articles or investor reports, but that Emily found increasingly meant more to her than any boardroom victory ever had. Driving home afterward, Emily thought about the question that had stayed with her the longest. What if there's no jet waiting outside? She thought about how much of her own story had been reduced in the public imagination to that single dramatic image, the SUV, the billionaire brother, the stunned crowd on the courthouse steps. It made for a compelling headline. It made for the kind of story people shared, commented on, felt something watching unfold. But it had never been the truth of what actually changed her life. The truth was quieter and far less cinematic. The truth was a woman sitting in a parking garage, hands trembling on a steering wheel, choosing not to cry, choosing instead to simply breathe through the ache of finally admitting that 7 years of silence had cost her more than she'd ever let herself calculate. The truth was that love, real love, was never supposed to require disappearing. It was never supposed to ask one person to shrink so the other could feel large. It was never supposed to survive on one person's endless patience, while the other person never once had to reach for anything at all. Real love. Emily had come to believe looked less like sacrifice and more like witness, two people actually seeing each other, actually asking, actually noticing again and again, not because it was owed, but because that noticing was the entire point of choosing to build a life alongside someone else in the first place. She hadn't needed a billionaire's jet to learn that. She had simply needed to stop waiting for someone else to teach it to her and finally teach it to herself. And that, more than any fortune, any company, any headline, that was the truest inheritance she had ever claimed.